Hey everyone, welcome back to Hacker News Daily, where we break down the top stories that got the tech community talking. Yesterday was absolutely wild on Hacker News. We reviewed 29 stories, and let me tell you, the 5 that rose to the top really capture this fascinating moment we're in with technology. We've got everything from pure creative chaos with an AI-powered infinite product generator to some serious discussions about the state of our industry, from visa exploitation and tech hiring to the death of social media as we know it. Oh, and sandwiched in between all that existential tech angst, a reminder that individual developers can still build absolutely mind-blowing things, and a spicy debate about whether AI is actually making us better programmers or just making us feel productive. So, buckle up, let's dive into yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. All right, now let's dive into something that's equal parts brilliant and absolutely bonkers. A store that generates products from anything you type in search. This is anycrap.shop, and yes, that's the actual name, and it's exactly as wild as it sounds. So picture this. You type in literally anything. A sandwich that teaches calculus, or socks that smell like victory. And boom, within seconds, the site generates a product visualization complete with packaging, marketing copy, the whole 9 yards. The creator pitched this as an infinite product catalog that finds products from parallel dimensions. And honestly, after seeing what people have been creating, that description feels about right. What's fascinating here is that this isn't trying to be a real store, or at least not in any conventional sense. It's more like shopping theater. Performance art meets e-commerce. The site's been absolutely exploding on Hacker News with nearly 700 points, and the creators dealing with what I can only imagine is a terrifying AWS bill right now. They mentioned that over 15,000 products have been generated already, and their token costs are going through the roof. The community reaction has been incredible to watch unfold. People are going absolutely wild with this thing, generating everything from weird tech stuff to snacks from outer space. One user said this brings back the spirit of the old internet, when people built weird, delightful things just because they could, not because there was a clear monetization strategy. And honestly, when's the last time you saw something online that was just purely, unapologetically fun? But here's where it gets really interesting from a tech perspective. The image generation is surprisingly fast and high quality. We're talking seconds to generate these product concepts, and they're cohesive. The packaging looks real, the products feel plausible even when they're completely absurd. The system prompts must be incredibly well crafted to maintain this level of consistency. Now, not everyone's completely sold on the execution. One user pointed out that after playing with it for a while, everything starts to look kind of samey. The AI has that telltale aesthetic that we're all getting familiar with. You know what I mean? That slightly too perfect, slightly too glossy look that screams, I was made by Midjourney or DALL-E. And there's this hilarious limitation where the AI just cannot handle negation properly. Someone tried to generate a book with no pages, and well, you can imagine how that went. But what really caught my attention in the discussion was all the potential business angles people are throwing around. Some folks are suggesting this could be a legitimate market research tool. Let people generate whatever crazy products they want, track what gets the most interest, then actually manufacture the popular ones. Others are talking about it as shopping therapy without the guilt. You get the dopamine hit of finding the perfect product without actually spending money or accumulating stuff. There's even this wild idea floating around about connecting it to print-on-demand services. Imagine, you generate your existential dread coffee mug, or whatever, and then you can actually order it. The legal implications alone make my head spin. Who owns the copyright on an AI-generated product based on a user prompt? What happens when someone inevitably generates something that looks exactly like an existing trademarked product? The creator seems to be taking it all in stride, though they're clearly not prepared for this level of viral attention. They're scrambling to optimize costs while keeping the experience smooth. And I've got to say, the fact that it's still running smoothly with thousands of people hammering it is pretty impressive. You know what this really reminds me of? Those old web toys from the early 2000s, things like the hamster dance or those sites where you could slap a virtual person with an eel, completely pointless, utterly delightful, and somehow exactly what the internet needed. In an era where every startup is trying to be the next billion-dollar unicorn, there's something refreshing about a project that's just weird and fun. And maybe that's the real product here. Not the AI-generated gadgets, but the experience itself. The joy of typing in something ridiculous and seeing it manifest as a real product. It's collaborative creativity between human imagination and machine generation. And even if everything does start looking a bit samey after a while, there's something magical about that first moment when you see your absurd idea rendered as a legitimate-looking product. Speaking of AI and creativity, that brings us to a heated debate that erupted yesterday about AI's role in actual software development. And George Hotz, the iPhone jailbreak guy, just threw a massive grenade into the discussion. All right, shifting gears here, let's dive into AI coding. And wow, this one really struck a nerve on Hacker News with over 350 points and nearly 250 comments. George Hotz, who you might know from his iPhone jailbreaking days or his self-driving car startup, AI, just dropped a pretty spicy take on the whole AI coding assistant phenomenon. So here's the provocative bit. Hotz basically says that getting excited about AI coding is like getting excited that your compiler can write code. He's arguing that these AI assistants, whether it's Copilot, Cursor, or whatever the hot new tool is this week, they're just compilers that happen to take English as input instead of Python or JavaScript. And in his view, that makes them worse, not better. Now, his reasoning is actually pretty interesting. He points out that English is a terrible programming language. Think about it, there's no formal specification for English, right? When you write Python code, there's a spec that tells you exactly what for I in range 10 will do every single time. But when you tell an AI, create a function that sorts a list, well, what kind of sort? In place or not? Stable or unstable? Ascending or descending? The ambiguity is baked right in. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Hacker News crowd is not buying it, like at all. And the pushback reveals something fascinating about who's actually finding value in these tools. One commenter, Chris Marshall NY, makes this wild comparison to Adderall. They're saying AI coding might be like stimulants. You feel super productive, you're cranking out code, but are you actually getting more done, or are you just feeling like you are while potentially making things worse? The community seems split into camps here. You've got experienced developers saying, look, I've been coding for 30 years, and this thing is genuinely helpful as a smart autocomplete on steroids. Then you've got others agreeing with Hotz, saying it's all hype, and that the perceived 20% productivity boost might actually be making them 19% slower in reality. One comment that really stood out came from someone pointing out that Hotz might be suffering from what I'd call the expert blind spot. If you're George Hotz, if you're in that top 0.001% of programmers who can hold entire systems in your head and code at the speed of thought, maybe AI coding tools don't help much. But for the other 99.999% of us, for the data scientist who needs to write a quick web scraper, for the back-end developer who occasionally needs to touch front-end code, these tools are game changers. There's also this deeper philosophical argument happening about whether AI is creating the problems it claims to solve. One commenter, ZKmon, makes this fascinating analogy to cars. They're saying, look, cars didn't just solve transportation, they fundamentally restructured our cities, created suburbs, made walking impossible in many places, and then became necessary because of the world they created. Are AI coding tools doing the same thing? Are they changing what programming means in a way that makes them indispensable? The non-determinism thing Hotz brings up is crucial too. When you compile code, you get the same output every time for the same input. With AI, you might get different code for the same prompt depending on Who knows what? The phase of the moon? What the model had for breakfast? This unpredictability is either a feature or a bug, depending on who you ask. What's fascinating is that many commenters are treating AI coding assistants not as compilers, but as junior developers. One person said they use it exactly like they'd use a junior dev. Give it clear tasks, review everything carefully, and iterate on the output. And viewed through that lens, suddenly it makes more sense. You wouldn't expect deterministic output from a junior developer either, right? The really telling thing is who's defending these tools most vigorously. It's not just newbies, it's experienced developers who've learned how to leverage them effectively, and interestingly, non-professional programmers who need to code occasionally. For them, the difference between struggling for hours and getting working code in minutes is transformative, even if that code isn't perfect. Hatz does make one point that nobody really disputed, though. His opening salvo about people not caring about truth, only what pumps their bags. He connects the AI coding hype to the billions wasted on self-driving cars that still aren't here. And yeah, there's definitely some of that energy in the AI space right now. The difference is, people are actually shipping products with AI coding assistants today, even if we're arguing about how much they really help. The whole debate really comes down to this. Are these tools making us better programmers, or are they making programming different? And maybe more importantly, does it matter if the code ships and works? You know, while we're debating whether AI can help us code better, there's someone out there who just built an entire operating system from scratch, by themselves, as a hobby. And this story is the perfect counterpoint to all this AI discussion. All right, switching gears here to something that absolutely blew my mind when I saw it trending on Hacker News. We're talking about SkiftOS, a hobby operating system built completely from scratch. And when I say from scratch, I mean this developer literally built everything themselves. So here's what makes this story fascinating and why it got over 400 points and sparked such an intense discussion. We're living in an era where most developers are gluing together libraries and frameworks, right? And then you have someone like this who goes, you know what? I'm going to build an entire operating system. Oh, and not just for one architecture. Let's do ARM, x86, and RISC-V while we're at it. The creator, who goes by Monax, has been working on this for 6 years. 6 years. And get this, they have a day job. This is their hobby project. The Hacker News community is basically having an existential crisis over this because, well, look at what this person built. We're not just talking about a basic kernel that can boot and print "Hello World." This is a full microkernel with a custom build system, a bootloader, a complete UI framework with compositing, and, wait for it, they even built their own browser engine. I mean, who does that? Actually, that's a great question that came up in the discussion. One commenter, TinkersW, asked why OS developers always seem to build browsers. And honestly, it's a fair point. But I think it shows the ambition here. It's like, if you're going to build an OS from scratch, why not go all the way, right? What really caught the community's attention, though, was the code quality. Several developers dove into the codebase and came back genuinely impressed. They're using modern C++ features like modules and coroutines, which, if you know anything about systems programming, that's pretty cutting-edge stuff. One developer mentioned it has Rust-inspired elements too, which is interesting because it shows they're not just coding in a vacuum. They're incorporating modern programming concepts into low-level systems work. The discussion got pretty philosophical at times. There's this whole thread about whether one person doing this proves the 10x developer concept, with people basically saying, how is this even possible? And honestly, I get it. When you look at what large teams at major companies produce versus what this one person created in their spare time, it really makes you think about productivity in software development. There was one contrarian view that stood out. A user named Boogerlad suggested that if you're building an OS from scratch, why not completely rethink everything? They proposed ditching hierarchical file systems entirely and using a relational database instead. Which, that's certainly a take. It's radical, but hey, if you're already building everything from zero, why not question every assumption? The creator actually showed up in the thread, which was cool. They were helping people figure out how to run it. Apparently, you need to use their custom build system called Blueprints, and they recommended using Podman for the development environment. Very helpful, very humble about the whole thing. You know what strikes me most about this? It's the reminder that individual developers can still create incredibly ambitious projects. In an industry that's increasingly dominated by massive tech companies and complex enterprise systems, here's someone in their spare time building something that would typically take a team of engineers. And they're not doing it for money or fame. It's literally called a hobby OS. It's pure passion for the craft. The technical architecture choices are fascinating too. They went with a microkernel design, which is notoriously difficult to get right. Most hobby OS projects go with monolithic kernels because they're simpler, but nope, this person chose the harder path. And supporting 3 different architectures? That's just showing off at this point. What I love about stories like this is they inspire other developers to think bigger. Sure, not everyone's gonna go build an operating system, but it reminds us that those seemingly impossible side projects might actually be possible. You just need 6 years and an absolutely ridiculous amount of dedication. All right, so our next story is something that really struck a nerve on Hacker News. Corporations are trying to hide job openings from U.S. citizens. This got over 600 points and nearly 500 comments. And honestly, after diving into the discussion, I can see why people are fired up. Now, we couldn't access the original Hill article, but the Hacker News discussion itself paints a pretty vivid picture of what's going on here. Essentially, we're talking about companies that are supposedly following the law by posting job openings to American workers first, but they're doing it in ways that are, let's just say, creatively unhelpful. Think job postings at 2 a.m. on local TV stations or tiny classified ads in small-town newspapers that nobody reads anymore. It's technically compliance, but it's really just theater. The heart of this whole thing revolves around the H-1B visa system, and the discussion got really interesting here. Multiple commenters described H-1B workers as essentially indentured servants, and that's not hyperbole when you think about it. These workers often can't easily switch jobs without risking their visa status, which means they're stuck accepting lower wages and worse conditions than their American counterparts would tolerate. One commenter pointed out that this creates a perfect storm. Companies get cheaper labor that can't complain or leave, while American workers get undercut on wages. What really caught my attention was how systematic this apparently is. People in the comments were sharing specific examples of how companies game the system. They'll write job requirements so narrowly specific that only their pre-selected H-1B candidate could possibly qualify. Must have exactly 3.7 years experience with this proprietary internal tool that only exists at our company, that sort of thing. Then they post it somewhere nobody will see it, wait the required time, and say, "Oh well, no qualified Americans applied." The reform proposals were actually pretty thoughtful. The most popular suggestion was to completely restructure H-1B allocation based on salary. Instead of the current lottery system, you'd prioritize the highest-paying positions first. The logic is pretty elegant. If a company really needs a specialized foreign worker, they should be willing to pay top dollar. This would eliminate the wage suppression incentive overnight. Another commenter suggested that H-1B workers should be able to change jobs freely, which would remove that indentured servant dynamic and force companies to actually compete on compensation and working conditions. What's fascinating is how this discussion reveals a fundamental tension in tech hiring. On one hand, you've got companies claiming there's a massive talent shortage, and they desperately need foreign workers. On the other hand, you've got qualified American workers saying they can't even get interviews. And when they do, they're being lowballed on salary because companies know they can get H-1B workers for less. The more cynical commenters pointed out that this isn't really about finding the best talent at all. It's about finding adequate talent that won't complain about 60-hour weeks and below market pay. And when you frame it that way, suddenly all these creative job posting strategies make perfect sense from a business perspective, even if they're ethically questionable. You know what really stands out to me? This isn't just about tech workers being angry about competition. The discussion showed a pretty sophisticated understanding of how these visa programs create perverse incentives that hurt everyone, including the H-1B workers themselves who get trapped in exploitative situations. It's a system that seems to benefit nobody, except the companies gaming it, and even then, only in the short term, because it damages their reputation and company culture. The comment thread also touched on something we don't talk about enough: how this practice affects innovation and knowledge transfer. When you treat your foreign workers as disposable, cost-saving measures rather than valued team members, you're not getting their best work or ideas. Several people mentioned knowing brilliant H-1B workers who were basically just keeping their heads down and doing the minimum to maintain their visa status, rather than taking risks or proposing innovative solutions. It's one of those stories where the more you dig into it, the more broken the whole system appears. And judging by those 500 comments, a lot of people in tech have personal experience with this dysfunction.
You know, we've been talking about all these systemic problems in tech: exploitative hiring practices, debates about whether AI is helping or hurting us. But there's an even bigger elephant in the room. The platforms we've all been building, the social networks that were supposed to bring us together, well, they might be the most broken thing of all. Story 5. Social media promised connection, but it has delivered exhaustion. Now, let's dive into something that's really striking a nerve in the tech community. Social media promised connection, but it has delivered exhaustion. This piece has absolutely blown up on Hacker News with over 300 points and nearly 200 comments. And honestly, I think it's hitting so hard because it's saying what we've all been feeling, but maybe couldn't quite articulate. So here's the core argument. Social media is essentially in its death throes, not because people are leaving en masse, but because the actual social part, the human connection we were all promised, has been completely drowned out by this tsunami of AI-generated content, bot accounts, and algorithmic manipulation. The author paints this really dystopian picture where you're scrolling through your feed and you see the same stock portrait photo attached to 10 different accounts, all posting the exact same life-changing financial advice or wellness tips. It's like we're not even pretending anymore that there are real humans behind these accounts. What really gets me about this piece is how it frames this as a fundamental betrayal. Remember when Facebook was about connecting with your college friends? When Twitter was the scrappy platform for sharing what you had for breakfast? The article argues we've witnessed this complete philosophical shift from platforms designed for genuine human connection to what they call the generative AI-fueled late attention economy. That's such a perfect phrase, isn't it? Late attention economy, like late-stage capitalism, but for our eyeballs. The Hacker News discussion is fascinating because it's not just people complaining, though there's plenty of that. It's this really thoughtful examination of where things went wrong. Multiple commenters zero in on the feed as the turning point. One person made this brilliant observation that social media stopped being social and became just media the moment we moved from peer-to-peer interaction to this one-way consumption model. Think about it. When's the last time you actually had a real conversation on Facebook or Instagram? Not just commenting, looks great on someone's photo, but an actual back-and-forth dialogue. There's this whole thread about whether we should literally ban algorithmic feeds when it comes to public discourse. And I know that sounds extreme, but the argument is compelling. These algorithms aren't just showing us content, they're actively shaping how we think, what we believe, who we vote for. One commenter compared it to allowing cigarette companies to advertise to kids. The algorithms are that harmful, they argue. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone agrees on what the problem actually is. There's this great debate about whether exhaustion is even the right word. One commenter pushes back saying, look, people aren't exhausted by social media, they're addicted to it. It's not like work that tires you out, it's like gambling. You keep pulling that slot machine lever, scrolling for the next dopamine hit. And they have a point, right? If we were truly exhausted, we'd just stop. But we don't.
The discussion also gets into some really specific examples of how different platforms are handling this crisis. There's this whole tangent about Tumblr that I found fascinating. The article apparently calls Tumblr dead, and this user jumps in like, hold up, Tumblr isn't dead, it just found its niche. They argue that we're conflating alive with big, and maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe the future isn't one massive platform, but a bunch of smaller, more focused communities. What's really sobering is how many people in the comments are sharing their experiences of just disconnecting, not rage quitting, but this gradual realization that social media was making their lives worse. One person described replacing their Twitter habit with reading actual books and local news, and they said it was like coming out of a fog. Another mentioned moving to Mastodon and finding actual conversations again, though they admitted the network effects aren't the same. The technical folks in the comments are proposing all sorts of solutions: chronological feeds only, transparency requirements for algorithms, public APIs that let users control their own experience. But there's this underlying pessimism that none of it will happen because, well, the current system is too profitable. The bots, the AI slop, the rage bait, it all drives engagement, and engagement drives ad revenue. You know what really stands out to me? Nobody in that comment thread is defending the current state of social media. Not one person is saying, actually, things are fine. The debate is all about diagnosis and treatment, not whether the patient is sick. And that consensus, that's remarkable for Hacker News, where you can usually count on someone to play devil's advocate. The article ends on this note about how we might be witnessing the end of social media as we know it, and maybe that opens the door for something new. But reading through these comments, I'm not sure anyone's really optimistic about what comes next. It feels more like we're all standing around watching this slow-motion car crash, knowing we should look away but unable to stop scrolling, which is, I guess, exactly the problem we're talking about. And that's a wrap on yesterday's top stories from Hacker News. What a journey, right? We started with the pure chaotic joy of anycrap.shop, a reminder that the internet can still surprise and delight us. We wrestled with whether AI is making us better coders or just making us feel productive. We saw what one dedicated developer can accomplish with SkiftOS, building an entire operating system as a hobby project. We exposed the dark underbelly of tech hiring practices, and we ended with this collective realization that the social media platforms we've all helped build might be fundamentally broken. You know what strikes me about these 5 stories together? They paint this picture of tech at a crossroads. We've got incredible individual creativity happening, whether it's AI-powered product generators or handcrafted operating systems. But we've also got these massive systemic problems: exploitative labor practices, platforms that manipulate rather than connect, and this ongoing debate about whether our tools are actually making us better or just different. Out of 29 stories on Hacker News yesterday, these are the 5 that the community elevated to the top. And I think that says something about where our heads are at right now in tech. We're celebrating creativity, questioning our tools, calling out exploitation, and maybe, just maybe, starting to imagine what comes next. Thanks for joining me for today's Hacker News Daily. I'll be back tomorrow with the stories that get the tech world talking. Until then, keep building, keep questioning, and maybe take a break from that infinite scroll.